So I'm going to start off. There we go. So I got started in this from the Data Creation Profiles project, and we did a series of interviews with faculty trying to understand their situation, their data, and their needs surrounding data. And over again, we heard, man, I wish my graduate student knew how to do this better. Or, yeah, you really have to ask my graduate student. They're the ones who really are in charge of the data. They know more about the data than I do. And so after hearing these over and over again, we started asking questions about, well, would an educational program of some kind be useful for you? And they said, generally, yeah, that'd be great. That would really be helpful. And then the next logical follow-up question is, okay, well, what would that program consist of? And that's where it sort of fell apart of, just how to do it better. And so what we did was to go through the interviews that we had conducted and to do some analysis to figure out where really the pain points were and where areas of interest for educational programs might be. And we came up with this list of 12, which we sort of called the data information literacy competencies. And these were sort of starting points for areas of investigation. We cast our net fairly wide with these. These are things that librarians may or may not be able to do. Data visualization, for example, is certainly a part of looking at the utility and the value of research data. It's not my area of expertise, but it is the area of expertise for some librarians that we know, and some librarians could contribute to programs along those lines. So we wanted to, again, define our net fairly wide in looking at where we could possibly make a difference. So the next stage, once we had sort of the areas of interest to explore, was to actually do some exploration. And we got a grant from the IMLS, pulled together some librarians. We have 5 teams total. There were 2 teams at Purdue, where I used to work, from 4 institutions. We formed teams of a data librarian, someone who was really interested and invested in working with research data, a subject librarian, and a faculty member. And with those teams, we set out to answer 2 particular questions. What knowledge and skills with data would graduate students need to know to be successful in their discipline? So really looking at sort of the disciplinary focus and recognizing that we're not training them to be mini librarians, but we're training them to be more aware and conscious of the work that they do as data producers within the context of their particular research field. And then what role could librarians play in teaching these particular skills? Again, not assuming that librarians are going to be the end-all, be-all answer to this, but looking at how can we start the conversation, train them, educate them in areas where we can, but also bring in other parts of the university or the world to help further their education. And I think that's something that librarians are particularly good at that we ought not to forget in looking at research data services, our ability to understand the large lay of the land and to pull people together to make things happen. So since the Data Information Literacy Project, I've gone on to do 2 other sort of major data information literacy efforts. I taught a semester-long course with the agricultural librarian at Purdue, Marianne Stoll-Bracke. This was a not-for-credit course. We were not a part of the College of Agriculture, so instead we convinced the College of Agriculture to put up stipends for our students. Each of our students was paid $1,500 to take the class and to sort of test it out to give us a sense of what worked and what didn't and where did they see the value and where do we see the impact in terms of interacting with them on data information literacy type subjects. Now that I'm in Michigan, I am teaching a semester-long class with our engineering librarian, Sarah Samuel, and one of our graduate students from the School of Information at Michigan, Joanna Thielen. This is in fact a credit course. We convinced the college to allow us to become adjunct professors and to offer college credit, or graduate student credit actually, for our students taking this particular course. So some observations from the interviews and the interactions we've had with faculty and students in developing and considering data information literacy programs. First of all, these are widely seen, the 12 that I showed, are widely seen as being important for graduate students to have to master before they graduate. So there's some differences in terms of how important certain things are. Things that are more immediate that graduate students will put into practice, things like managing data, organizing data, are generally seen as more important than things like data preservation or data sharing that come on later down the line. But overall, these things are seen as important as a general rule. But students generally don't receive formal training in these areas. They may take, they definitely take research methods courses, but it's more focused on the research itself and the methodology behind the research, and less about the context of doing research and generating data and working with that data. But there's an assumption on the part of faculty that students should have received this at some particular point. And so by the time they get to the lab, well, it's almost too late. The lab really isn't set up to provide that kind of formal education and to give them the basic knowledge and foundation that they need. And so there's also a lack of formal policies in the research team. So when graduate students start in a lab or as graduate students, they're sort of welcomed into the club, they're sat down, they're sort of told the secret oral history of how things are done in that lab. But there's usually a lack of policies for them to refer back to or to really sort of follow or understand as a foundation of their work. And so they're sort of left on their own to learn it and absorb it as they go through. And because of that, learning is often self-directed in this environment. When they have a problem, they tend to go to their advisor. One of the folks that we talked with sort of called this the pain and suffering method. A graduate student will come to him and he'll say, well, the graduate student will say, I have this problem, I'm not sure what to do. The advisor will say, well, you need to go figure it out and solve it for yourself. The graduate student will try and come back and be maybe half successful, and then the advisor will sort of walk them through the rest of the process. And that sounds kind of cruel, and I'm being a little flippant about that, but the expectation for graduate students is they are assuming a professional identity. They're becoming a chemist, or they're becoming a sociologist, or whatever it is they're studying. They need to be able to handle these things on their own as professionals, because they are going to be independent one day off on their own particular lab or their own particular area of study. And so they're trying to prepare them for that particular day. But the challenge is because learning is self-directed and it tends to be at the point of need of, I have a problem right now with this data, that they tend to focus on that point of need rather than these larger concepts of, say, sharing data or preserving data or thinking into the future beyond that immediate point of need. And so they lack perspective and even a larger awareness of the kind of resources and tools and support that is out there to help them do more with their data as they're actually going through and creating that particular data set. So in thinking about classes that we put together, we had some foundational approaches in mind. As you can tell, my focus really has been mostly on graduate students, and we really thought it was important to focus on the student's role as a graduate student. So again, not just think about what is in this for the field or for the larger purpose behind doing all these things or investing yourself in all of these important attributes, but thinking about their role right now and where their pain points are. How can we help them both do what they have to do right now, but also prepare for the future? We really thought it was very important to be contextualized through the disciplinary standards and practices. We have things as librarians, we have expertise as librarians that we think are important to convey, but they are not becoming librarians. They're becoming, civil engineers or whatever. And so it's important to connect them to other resources and really the culture of practice of, say, civil engineering as it pertains to research data and as it pertains to working with research data. We really thought it was important also for students to use their own data. So if I hand you a canned data set and say, pretend you're in charge of this and manage it, it's not going to mean anything to them. There's no investment there on their part to actually consider what this data could or should be or how it should be worked with. If they use their own data, they are very, very invested in that. It's their life's work at this point. And they really do need to pay attention to that and will be very invested in doing a better job with their data because there are direct benefits for themselves and for their advisor. So the data information literacy model that we came up with was to start out in the planning phase by doing some environmental scanning, getting a sense of the lay of the land, conducting interviews of both the faculty member and the students and perhaps others who are relevant or have a stake in the data information literacy program that we intend to develop. Then to develop that particular program, considering all the different attributes that have to go into creating a solid deliverable, then actually to deliver it, make it happen, and then to assess the outcomes. And it's a linear model. We have sort of the linear arrows there, but assessment really should be thought about throughout and really embedded into the rest of the process going forward. So the environmental scan, oftentimes we found in interviewing faculty that faculty themselves may not be aware of the kind of resources and tools and support that are available, and therefore the graduate students certainly aren't going to be necessarily aware of those things either. So doing some scanning, knowing where to look, thinking about standards as they pertain to things like metadata and to formats and the effects of those things that they have on the data and on data practice. Looking at repositories, what repositories are out there, what can they use for their own work, but then what do repositories expect in terms of deposits, what kind of metadata or structure or other context might be needed. Looking at journal publishers, so do they accept supplemental files? If so, under what conditions and what kind of support do they offer for the maintenance of those supplemental files? Or do they expect a citation to the data to be a part of the work, a part of the publication that is submitted? So looking at what do they value and what are their expectations. Scholarly organizations, looking at statements or sort of areas of coverage in conferences. Are these things talked about? If so, how are they talked about? Who talks about them? What language do they use? And similarly for literature review as well. Are these things published? If so, how are they published? Where are they published? What kind of terms and concepts are behind these data management areas of interest for us? How are they expressed in the literature and elsewhere? So interviews, there are two reasons why we really felt it was important to do interviews. So just as it's important to bring disciplinary context to bear in data information literacy programs, it's also important to acknowledge local practice and local cultures. You know, these things have been done, and they're usually done for a reason, and they may not be great reasons, but it's still part of the current flow and the current sort of process of getting things done. And rather than trying to ignore that or sweep it aside, we need to work with that and build off of what they're already doing to augment it rather than to try to replace it. It's also important to understand their perceptions and their priorities with regards to the 12 data information literacy competencies that we've got. So really helping shape our thinking through what their thinking is currently. And again, to sort of build off of that and to augment that. So we interviewed faculty, we interviewed students, we also interviewed other stakeholders at times. So if there was a lab manager, we tried to interview him or her, or someone providing IT support, or someone providing administrative support who is related to data in some way, shape, or form, to really try to be inclusive and to take into consideration that data isn't necessarily a solo practice. It touches upon a great number of people. So for the interviews, what we did was to try to take one of the 12 data information literacy competencies, to break it down according to possible skills that might fall under that competency, but to be very cautious about how we did this. So when I say preservation, that probably means something to you, but it may mean something very different to the researcher that we're talking to. And so rather than try to be prescriptive and say, this is preservation, what do you think? To get them to tell us, what do you think preservation means? How do you understand preservation, or sharing in this case? So we asked them to sort of consider the list of skills, what it might include, to sort of give them some prompts to think about this, but then to tell us what was important to them. And then we also asked them to indicate how important do you think it is for a student, in this case, to be knowledgeable in this competency by the time you graduate on a scale of 1 to 5. And then how would you describe your current level of knowledge and skills in this area from 1 to 5? So we get a sense of what the gaps are. If they circle 5 for the importance, but 3 for where they are now, we know we've got some work to do. But in actuality, the numbers are less important than the conversation, the discussion that happens during the interview. So these are more prompts and sort of ways to start discussion, but the richness, really where we learn the most, is from the subsequent discussion and the subsequent interaction that we have with the students or whoever we're interviewing. So in developing the program, once we've got the environmental scan and the interviews completed, taking that information and analyzing it to develop the program, really taking what we've learned and sort of structuring it around real-world context as much as we possibly can. Then we need to sort of allocate our resources. So how much time do we have? Do we have an entire semester to offer this? Do we have a one-shot class? What is our availability to actually try to impact or try to teach something of value to students? And planning accordingly. It's really easy to say, I want to teach them every possible thing under the sun, but recognize that time and people and space are limited. And so knowing really how to allocate those appropriately. People, as I said, I have a certain set of expertise with data, but it's certainly not all-encompassing. It doesn't touch anywhere close to the 12 that we discussed here. So depending on what the areas of interest are, what the basis of the program will be, identifying other experts either in the library or on campus that we can pull in and invite to share their expertise and their knowledge with our students is really important. And then space. So for our course at the University of Michigan, we had originally signed up for a design lab, which is a wide open space, lots of sort of whiteboards and different areas to sort of come together and have different types of discussion, which was great, but it was actually too open. There was too much space, too much noise reverberated from other places. We wound up having to change our space into a more confined space, really to make the classroom work. And so space, I think, can often be overlooked as a facet of developing programs, but it is an important consideration to do or to consider in developing your particular program. The next step is to develop your curriculum, figure out what is it you're going to teach and how are you going to teach it. Think about all the things that go with that as well. So what kind of assignments are you going to have? How are you going to grade those assignments? Do you have any rubrics or do you need rubrics? All the things that go into planning a class, again, depending on the size and the scope of what you're trying to convey. And then managing expectations, so not forgetting that there are other people who have a stake or an interest in the work that you do, and trying to keep them involved and tell them what you do, and to manage their expectations. They may think you're doing one thing when in fact you're doing something else, but letting them know that, really being open up front with what you think you can do and your capacity for this particular program. So this is the outline for the University of Michigan class. It's a little hard to read through the font, my apologies, but there is the 14 weeks sort of broken down by particular topic. We had 2 hours for the class over 14 weeks. We had a number of guest speakers. These are just 4 of them. We had an IT specialist come and talk about storage and storage options on campus and kinds of questions to ask yourself when considering types of storage and how that might affect the data. We had a data visualization expert come and talk more about sort of how to think about visualization and how to sort of tell your story and tell your science effectively through visualizing your data. We had our copyright officer come and talk a bit about data and intellectual property. But we've also found that students have lots of questions just about their papers and their other sort of normative works and around copyright and what they're able to have. So we expanded that session to include publications in addition to data, again, based on student interest and feedback. And then we had our director of compliance for the College of Engineering come and talk about data ethics and talk about how data ethics are translated into university policy, either ideally or perhaps sketchy sometimes. But a lot of times students don't see the whole process or the whole network behind doing research. And so this is sort of a chance to pull back the curtain and expose the fact that university actually provides a lot of support or a lot of guidance on developing content, data in particular, even though it's not often seen. Again, the space was in the design lab, as I mentioned, until we had to move it. So then once you develop the program, there's actually implementing it. And we found that a couple of things worked really well for us. The use of active learning and peer networks. We tried to divide our sessions into 3 parts, one being presentation, the second being discussion to try to engage them in the topic of the day, and then the third being some kind of exercise or active learning kind of endeavor to get them sort of thinking and applying what they've learned for that particular session. What's really important is engaging students with their peers. Other students have often gone through or have questions or challenges that are similar to other students in the field. And sort of by coming together and by discussing them, we found that that really tends to have a larger impact than just listening to me drone on for 2 hours. We try to be as flexible, responsive, and as student-driven as we can. With the course we taught at Purdue for the College of Agriculture, we set that up as a pilot, and we actually didn't create a syllabus for that particular class. We created a series of weekly lesson plans, and we had plotted out the first 3 weeks fairly concretely, but then we went to the students and asked, well, what really is your interest? And we took the information that we gathered from them through the interviews and through discussions to sort of plot out the rest of the class. And we ended up spending an awful lot of time, much more than we anticipated, on description of data and metadata, but that's really where they got stuck and they really wanted more assistance and more attention paid. So we were able to do that through adjusting to the flexibility that we were afforded through the nature of that particular class. And then again, considering your stakeholders, and don't just consider them at the beginning, but consider them as you go through the class. As you're teaching the class, if people are interested in what you're doing, let them know what you're doing. Keep them in the loop as much as possible. So here's an example of a lesson plan from the class I'm teaching now at Michigan. We've got our topic for week 3, which is data management planning. So a little bit about what this is all about and why we're focusing on it. Our learning objectives, here's what we hope you get from the course, from this particular session. Here's what we want you to walk out with. Our readings and what we expect them to do in preparation for the class. We also had some optional resources. We didn't want to overload them with too much stuff, but if there's a particular area of interest, we wanted to give them some additional resources. We had them write through a reflection, which I'll talk about in a minute, and then our homework and our slide deck, the resources from the class, all in Canvas so they can get access to it and come back to it as needed. So assessment. there are two types of assessment which we tried to incorporate into our sessions. One being formative. These are things that are done during the class that allow us to sort of change and modify our trajectory according to what students are interested in. I talked about the initial survey that we did. So during the interviews, we would often interview students, but they wouldn't necessarily be the same students who take the class. So we would do sort of a mini interview, mini survey at the beginning session to get a sense of where they thought they were and what they wanted to focus on going forward. We looked at their assignments and tried to get a sense of what seems to be clicking, what seems to be working, where do things seem to be getting stuck, or what are the student challenges, and taking that information and trying to incorporate it into later sessions. Again, we spent 3 sessions on description and metadata because there were some hurdles to cross for the College of Ed class. And then the reflection, or what we call minute papers, essentially at the end of class for the last 10 minutes, we would ask them to answer 3 questions. What was the most important thing you learned today? What still seems kind of muddy or you're kind of stuck on? And how could we do this better? And so we're taking that information again to get a sense of taking their pulse as to what was working, what we maybe needed to work a bit more on. Finally, we did some summative assessment. So after the course was done, we kind of had an end of the semester focus group. We take time at the end of the last session to sort of debrief about the course and get their impact as to how was it overall, what made sense to you, what didn't make sense to you, what do we need to adjust or account for. And then with the College of Ed course, and we intend to do this with Michigan's as well, we sought out our students 6 months afterwards and did a little mini interview with them as well. So really asking, what did you learn from our course and how did you apply it in your own work? Again, really to get a sense of what kind of real-world impact did this course have on student learning and student practice. So the impact of the course, this is a quote from one of our students from the College of Agriculture class. We did a session on data life cycles, and this student really thought that was valuable, really gave him a sense of sort of the bigger picture and how his data could potentially have value for others down the line. So that was very gratifying and good to see that we had sort of achieved our goal in that particular instance. But we also heard from another student who was like, yeah, the big picture was good, the data lifecycle section was good, but I didn't have anything to contextualize it with. It was sort of overwhelming to think of like, oh my God, there's all this stuff that I could potentially do or need to do that I'm not prepared to do yet. So as a result of this, for the Michigan class, we're trying to integrate more big picture things with more on-the-ground concrete things, to not overwhelm our students right from the get-go, but to introduce these things slowly over time and to connect them with local practice to bigger picture type issues. So doing that assessment was really valuable for us in planning subsequent iterations of the course. So why engage in data information literacy? I think I'm preaching to the choir here, hopefully, but it's a lot of work, as you probably got a sense from my talking through the model. There's a lot of investment and effort that has to happen in all of this, but I think it's really worth it because it is a service that is needed. Folks really do want this information and do want to know how to do this better, to make their lives easier, but also to make their field, to advance their field and to move everything forward. It's a great entry point for having discussions with graduate students and with faculty. You really do connect with your students. You have them in front of you. You are interacting with them in very deep and meaningful ways. It's a great way to build a strong relationship with folks. It's really a good way to understand how research is actually practiced. So we, as people who are interested in affecting change and how data are thought of and how data are worked with, we need to have an understanding of current practice in order to affect that change. We can't just come in and say, I'm from the library, I know how to do this, let me help you. We need to know what real-world practice is. And then finally, it's a means to increase the impact of the library. It's a way to demonstrate effectiveness through your assessment and through other means, to share your story, to share your successes in ways that I think will resonate with other folks on campus, to generate more interest and more business in the kind of work that you're doing. Okay, I want to take a moment to thank all the folks who worked with me on the Data Information Literacy Project, as well as the Institute for Museum and Library Science. A lot of hard work went into this, and we couldn't have done it without all of these folks.